What's up YouTube? So today I want to talk about switching DAWs. So for those who may not know, I've recently switched from Cubase to Bitwig. And I want to discuss a couple of the things that I miss a little bit from Cubase. And I also want to discuss a couple of the things that I think are going to change the game for me in Bitwig. So here is my list of 5 things I miss from Cubase and 5 things that I don't after changing to Bitwig Studio. Let's dive in and have a look. So one thing that I quickly want to outline before getting into the video is that changing DAWs is not an easy thing, specifically for newcomers who may not have experience with other DAWs in the first place. I've been doing a fair amount of live streams using Bitwig Studio, and I've been getting quite a few comments of people saying, oh, they tried Bitwig, but it was a little bit confusing compared to A or B software. And I think, yes, this does happen. You know, once you have a firm grasp of how a particular software works, once you're fluent with the key commands and all sorts of things like that, changing to something else will seem a bit like homework. It'll seem like everything is a bit harder than it should be as you're kind of adjusting your muscle memories and things so that you can understand the new key commands and stuff like that. I think it's important when trying out new DAWs to give it more than just the first glance. I know sometimes it's tough because demos don't often give you a lot of time to work with. I think it definitely helps to spend quite a few sessions in the software before actually making up your mind. So obviously at first when I dived into Bitwig, things, were a little bit confusing. I was pressing hotkeys that I'm used to in Cubase and they were doing things in Bitwig that I wasn't expecting. And so, breaking that kind of workflow is a little bit tough at first, especially if we've been using a particular software for a very long time, or if we are not used to switching softwares. I think maybe for me, I have the benefit of using video editing software, image editing software, and audio editing software, and each one has its own set of key commands. So I think maybe in my mind, I'm already switching workflows between different softwares. So this might be a little bit harder for some of you guys. But one thing to remember is, when first diving into a new DAW, it might be a good idea to stay away from hotkeys and try do everything with your actual click commands, stuff that you can actually access via a menu. Because most of the time it'll actually have a quick explanation of what each of these things is doing. Or at least you'll be able to deduce that by the name of the parameter. Once you see how intuitive Bitwig is with the clicking menus and those things, I think you'll start to realize how much of a powerful DAW it is, beyond just how your workflow applies to a DAW, but being able to learn new things and craft new workflows that are going to be more powerful in the long run. One of the main reasons for doing this video is not because I want to say one DAW is better than the other. Again, it all depends on what fits your workflow the best. I'm kind of just wanting to show the developers at Bitwig some of the things that I miss from Cubase. So hopefully we can maybe see stuff similar to this being added to Bitwig in the future. Because that's one thing that's quite amazing about the team at Bitwig is how fast the developments are actually happening. Number 1 on my list of things that I miss from Cubase is the advanced audio editing and offline processing system. So what is this? Basically, it's the very fluent audio editing system that's in Cubase. So there are various ways of doing this. I think that's one of the beauties of Cubase, but also a little bit of a curse, is that there are so many ways of doing each of the things that you need to do within a DAW that sometimes it may be a little bit confusing for those getting in for the first time. But again, this also means that we have various ways of being able to create our own workflows. So one thing that I truly miss about Cubase is, like I said, the advanced audio editing and offline processing. So what is this? So let's say, for example, I want to chop up this loop that I've got here, and I want to put an individual audio process onto each of these hits. This type of sound, being able to apply individual effects onto sounds in a sequence like this, used to be very tricky. Before we had plugins like Snapheap, Infiltrator, and those kinds of things, you had to actually do this thing by hand. So let's say, for example, we want to have an individual effect on each of these hits over here. Let me just loop this part. So in Cubase, we have the ability to just right-click over here, open the plugins, and we actually have our entire list of VST plugins, which we can add to the sound. I'm just going to pick random stuff over here. Maybe let's go for Snapheap, and I'm just going to choose a preset here. So we can get like very technical chop stuff by just processing individual stuff onto the individual channels. So I think that it is a valuable workflow to know, but nowadays with stuff like Infiltrator, it's not as important. That being said, it's nice to just have offline processing in case you want to alleviate your CPU from doing certain things. In this case, it's nice to kind of generate new ideas. So for example, we can just duplicate this, copy this onto a new channel, and then kind of remove the stuff that we did here. So now we have the original as it was in the track, but we can also choose the variation to use at different parts. Do you know what I mean? Another really powerful thing about the offline processing system is that you can set up, we can create banks of favorites that use stacks of plugins. So for example, we can press this plus and add plugins here. I'm just going to add random stuff. So, and then maybe like a cloud seed. And then here, we can drag this into a favorite like this. We'll get this pop-up, name it 1. And then what we can do is you can just click this and it'll add that rack of effects back here. So we can just remove all of these and you can click that and you'll see it'll bring back that process. So we can create, for example, like another favorites with, let's say, a snap heap, and let's stack this up a few times. Maybe have like different presets on each one. And let me open some of my presets up in here, and we can just select these all and then drag them here. So now we can stack them multiple times. For example, like 10 instances of snap heap, and then just say apply. It's obviously going to be like crazy because we're pushing the sound beyond what it should be pushed. But to do this kind of thing in plugins, it completely kills your CPU. So just being able to like offline process it on a sound, magical. I mean, this probably not going to sound magical, but you know what I mean. Just for inspiration purposes. Anyway, you get the picture. Item number 2 of things that I miss the most from Cubase is the highly customizable user interface and workflow parameters. I've actually seen this mentioned quite a few times. A few people have an issue with the color of the grid lines in Bitwig compared to the background color. There's not enough contrast between the two. And I don't personally have an issue with it, but you know, if I've seen it mentioned by a few people before, then clearly it's somewhat of an issue. So being able to change your color schemes of everything within a application is hugely beneficial for multiple reasons. Maybe some users have diminished sight or are working in rooms with lighting that doesn't quite suit the ideal environment. Being able to adjust how it looks like on your screen to suit you, I think is hugely beneficial because it's just going to make working with that software easier for you as a user. In Cubase, I believe absolutely everything is customizable in terms of the color, how it works, what number readouts you have. Here's just a quick example. In the Preferences user interface menus over here, you can actually change the color of your grid lines, cycle regions, ruler backgrounds, track loop colors, active loop, reversed loops, default track colors, mix console track colors. Everything you can basically change, and it's not just choosing from a preset group of colors. You've also got the ability to create schemes, and how this works is it basically judges how to color your project based on the information in the project. So for example, you can set it so that all MIDI tracks are a certain color, all audio tracks are a certain color, stuff in certain groups are a certain color, etc. Very advanced on that side of things, which I think it's very overlooked in a lot of DAWs because it may seem like it's not as much of a huge feature. I guess it's not one of those ones you can really sell. It's not a huge selling point. Yes, we have new customizable GUI. You know, it's not the huge feature that everybody's looking to see in the next generation DAW. But I think it's just as important as every other feature. Another very important thing is being able to customize how your cursor works in the transport. So here, for example, you can choose whether to return to the start position when the thing stops. You can choose different parameters to work with depending on how you like to work. For example, I often end up editing the same part over and over again. So when I pause, I want it to return to the beginning of the cycle which I've just played. So I believe Bitwig does this by default, but being able to turn it off might be beneficial for some users in a more audio editing kind of context. If you're listening to an hour's worth of podcast and you need to remove just one mistake, listening through it and then hitting pause, you obviously don't want that cursor to return to the beginning of that whole 1 hour podcast. So yeah, it depends how you want to work with the thing, and I think having these capabilities to be able to change how it works is just going to make it more applicable to more users. So this also extends into the widely customizable key commands section in Cubase, and also the macro section. I'm sure you guys know how fond I am of Cubase's macros. So what the macros are the ability to string various key commands, or what they call logical editor presets, to be able to automate various things in your DAW. One example is I made a macro that can arrange a track. So you take a loop, you press a button, and it kind of does certain parameters to take a loop and turn it into a full track. Obviously, there's still variations needed and stuff. It's not a perfect like AI track generator. It's just various tasks that I would end up doing repetitively in the DAW, but you can just speed it up by kind of doing a lot at once. So this is really, really cool, because if, for example, you're moving from one DAW to another where certain key commands you're used to, or you want to, change, for example, one keyboard into a key command center while the other one still remains your traditional keyboard, you can do various things like that, using key command functions and stuff to automate certain things in your DAW. This is also hugely helpful for stuff like Elgato Stream Decks. Here I've got like a bunch of Cubase macros that I can kind of like automate various things within the project. At the end of the day, those are just key commands, and I could set up something like that for Bitwig, but being able to customize the whole system within the DAW, so you can kind of create your own key commands and stuff that might not be possible, that you can kind of customize to your specific workflow, I think is very, very cool. So item number 3 on my list of things that I miss from Cubase is the track versions and nested MIDI channels. Track versions are the ability to create multiple tracks in a single track. It's not like nesting into a group. It just duplicates the kind of MIDI parameters, or in an audio context, it would duplicate your audio parameters and allow you to take several takes of a recording. In an instance of an instrument, we could, for example, let's say record in a MIDI over here, and then say, for example, we don't like that, or we want to try something different. We can say new version, and then we can try a different one. And now we can go back and audition to see which one we think fits the track the best. We actually like both of them. What we can do is we can just say Control-C, and you can copy this back onto the original channel. So now you have both. So this is a really cool way of being able to like retain all of the information of a track, but just, create a blank context to record some new stuff. So it's a nice way of, auditioning different melodies and different riffs and all sorts of things. And then, boom, blank slate, choose the things that work the best and drop them on there. Bear in mind, you can do similar workflows with stuff like the clip editor in both Ableton and Bitwig. So I think these types of things are, I think maybe it's become such a big part of my workflow because I don't have the clips. Another thing in Bitwig is the comping. I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly how that works, but you can achieve very similar things with audio channels using the comping in Bitwig. So the track versions, like I said, works on audio channels as well. So you can record something in from a guitar, new version, record something else, and see which one you did the best in, and then choose that. Very, very powerful for recording audio as well. So the nested MIDI layers are these lanes that you can drop down by pressing this button over here. So what this allows you to do is to record several MIDI lanes that are going to layer over the top of each other. So for example, let's say one key, and then let's do another one. So it's a very easy way of being able to record in quickly several different takes, and then, being able to like drag them onto a single take. So this is handy in situations where you have, for example, like a drum rack, and you want to create drum beats, but you want to still retain very easily editable system within those. So for example, you might want kick and snare in a single MIDI pattern, while the rest of your drums are in another MIDI pattern, just so it makes arranging the track easier at a later stage. For example, you can remove the patterns while the kick and snare is still there, and vice versa. Item number 4 on my list of things that I miss from Cubase is the advanced analysis tools like Supervision and Curve EQ. So for those who don't know how fond I am of Curve EQ, I actually don't use it for what it's supposed to be used for. Essentially what it is a system where you can feed it a particular frequency spectrum, and then it's supposed to kind of EQ a sound to fit into that spectrum. I'm not a big fan of using it in that context. What I use it for is just as a spectrum analyzer, but the handy thing is you can set, for example, presets. So here I've got a preset where I've got one of my favorite tracks that I've captured the spectrum of. So then what I do is I'll generally mix my tracks according to that spectrum. And this just, sometimes I won't hit it all the way, and I don't know if you guys can hear in this part where the mids are like way too present. You can quickly see that on the spectrum. So being able to use a spectrum to quickly reset your ears to kind of a standardized point is very helpful within music production. So obviously, Bitwig, Ableton, all the DAWs have spectrum analyzers, but I've always found that they're just not as accurate as I need them to be. Or at least they're accurate, don't get me wrong, they're accurate, but they don't give you the ability to really fine-tune things like the slope, the amount of time that it uses to read its average. For example, in Bitwig, the time of the spectrum, you can only choose from 4 different settings. And I find like what I'm used to is like in between the very lowest and frozen. It just makes the built-in scope a little bit harder to read. I mean, I could just buy plugins that allow me to do this. I could use Vox & Go's free version of Span, but then it requires a little bit of setup to be able to read a actual spectrum like this. Again, having the tools built into your DAW that are just ready to go so you don't have to buy anything extra or do any extra research. So you see, like in the track, we can actually hear the fundamental is a bit pronounced compared to the top end of the track, and that mid-range of that synth is also a little bit too pronounced. But we can quickly see what ranges those are by using a reference spectrum analyzer like Curve EQ with this setting from, captured from one of your favorite tracks. Just makes it easier to reference. Supervision is another absolutely incredible tool that comes built into Cubase. This allows you to customize your own analysis tools. So for example, we could have, instead of a phase scope here, we could just say, for example, let's put in a oscilloscope. We've got, this is pretty cool. It's like the stereo, I call it the stereo tree, but it's actually called a multi-panorama. Basically what this represents is your stereo spectrum across your frequency spectrum. So you can quickly tell if there's phasing or stereo information happening in your low end by just looking at this graph. And each of these little windows has their own settings, which you can choose, like how much time is visible, the minimum and maximum peak that it allows audio through, for example. Okay, so item number 5 on my list of things that I miss the most from Cubase, I'm pretty sure you guys were expecting this, is Vari Audio. Funny enough, I actually don't do that much vocal processing because the tool itself is actually designed for vocal processing. However, when I do need it, I feel like I miss it so much from Cubase because nothing like this exists in any other DAW. I believe that there is a plugin called Celemony Melodyne. It is very expensive though compared to what you get. And just having these abilities built into Cubase is absolutely fantastic. So let me show you how this works. So it's essentially a vocal tuning system which allows you to basically, not in real time, audio domain, you can actually change the pitch of particular chunks of audio. And it basically, so how it works is it detects the pitch and then it maps it onto particular keys. So here, let's just check what key we're in. Looks like we're in D sharp, and this is in G minor. So what we can do is we can actually take the G and shift it down to the D sharp. So let's just select everything, shift this down to the D. Or we could use one of these built-in scales here. So let's say, for example, okay, it is already in D-sharp Phrygian. You can set the scale over here. This is the scale that we've chosen for the track. And then you can say quantize. And then what it'll do is it'll use the same melody, but it'll make sure that only the pitches from the scale are present. It's just so cool for being able to take a sample, again, not just audio, this works with a lot of different contexts, being able to take a sample and just shift it into a melody that you want by just dragging different chunks of audio in that editor like that. I think that's such a powerful workflow. I wish that we would be able to see this more in different, maybe even plugins, but just being able to do this, it's so amazing, and it sounds really, really good. It sounds natural. We can push it to sound more unnatural by using stuff like straighten curve, and as you can see, what that does is it changes the little pitch shifts in between each of those things. We can also change the formant, so that would be the throat size, which just applies various filters to change the sound. We can also change things in time in that editor window. So for example, here you can see things are slightly off. We can actually shift this onto the grid to really fine tune it to get things to perfectly snap. So another thing that I really miss, I don't know which section to kind of tie this into, so I guess I'm going to kind of include it into the analysis tools. But another really huge feature in Cubase that I miss a little bit is the control room. So this is a little bit confusing to some users who first, get into Cubase. But one thing to kind of wrap your head around is that it's basically like having a channel that's outside of the project. If we have a look at our mixer in Cubase, traditionally in most DAWs, for those who know about like SonarWorks and stuff like that, and if I want to get my audio out of my project and into a streaming software or recording software, then I would generally, in most DAWs, I would generally put all those plugins onto the stereo output. And the problem with that is that, when you want to render your project, you have to remember to turn off stuff like SonarWorks and things like that, so it can become a little bit confusing. And also, it's just a little bit easier when switching between multiple projects to have the same analysis tools and the same set of stuff on every project, so that you don't have to, if you change a setting in a spectrum analyzer or something like that, it's going to be the same whenever you use that analysis tool, rather than how it's kind of locked into specific projects in most DAWs. For example, you can imagine if there was another stereo output after this stereo output, and that one allows you to add multiple plugins onto it, but then when you close the project and you open a new project, that final stereo output it still exists outside of the project. So I think something like this could be hugely beneficial inside Bitwig, because it would give us the ability to, for example, have a limiter on our project, or stuff like SonarWorks and that kind of thing. But then when we render the project, or when we do resampling or that kind of thing, any of those destructive audio processes won't actually be included into the audio of the project. And another thing that I've noticed, or that I've picked up, which is a bit weird, so for example, I use a piece of software called Restream, which is actually made by the guys who made Reaper, to get my audio out of Cubase or out of Bitwig and into OBS, which is what I use to record my audio and what I use to stream with. So if I render something in Cubase, because of the way that the render engine works, it turns down the audio output so that we don't hear it in the speakers, right? But if you have a plugin here that's sending to an OBS or something, weird glitches actually come through to the recording. So this actually happens on stream. Sometimes, if I've got Restream on my stereo output in Bitwig, when I render something, it goes blah, 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 and makes a very loud noise because it hasn't detected that there's the ability to actually, it hasn't detected to turn down the inputs of the stereo output rather than the outputs, if that makes any sense. I guess this is good and this is bad because maybe you have effects on your stereo output and you do want to render them into the project and various things like that. But I think, having an extra channel outside of the project is just having an extra channel outside of the project will just, defeat all of those, would actually just negate all of those issues. Also, maybe I just haven't figured it out yet, but pre and post, if you were to be able to put effects post fader on a Bitwig channel, again, this would alleviate that issue. So if we were able to put on stereo output, if we were able to put on a device onto a stereo output as a post fader effect, I think that would alleviate the issue, but I'm not 100% sure yet. Maybe somebody can confirm for me. Maybe I haven't figured it out yet. How do we do pre-post devices in Bitwig? Okay, onto my list of 5 things that I absolutely do not miss from Cubase. Let's dive in and have a look. Tip number 1 of things that I absolutely hate from Cubase is the fact that you have to create your entire folder structure and name the track before you've actually started working on it. So often cases, I don't even end up making a track. I end up just opening the DAW, playing around with Phase Plant or Vital, making some presets, and then closing the DAW afterwards. Then I end up with thousands of projects of kind of just random sounds that are, I end up with a folder full of hundreds of projects with just random sounds in them and maybe like 1 to 5 actual usable tracks. Not only is this incredibly wasteful, but I feel like this also not only is this incredibly wasteful in terms of your space on your hard drive and just the amount of time it takes to sort through all these things, but I also think it just wastes time in getting to the point. Often we feel inspired, we just want to open something up and create a melody, and then once we're at that point, then we should be able to decide, do we want to turn this into a project? Do we want to save this as a certain style of music or something like that? Oftentimes when I'm creating the folders, I don't even know what genre I want to make. I kind of just want to play around with sounds and then from there see where it takes me. And one thing also is the whole naming thing. You have to name your project before you actually start it. And I think this is weird because often we don't know what we want to name the projects until like the very end. And I'm not saying that doing it in Bitwig is any easier because you should definitely save your projects as you're working. But I think it stems from the whole idea of the fact that originally DAWs were designed to be recording music from artists. So for example, a person on their guitar would have a song that they've already written on the guitar or the piano or the drums or whatever. Then they would come to the person who has Cubase and they would open a project, create the folders, name it whatever that guitarist called their song, and then go from there. But in terms of electronic music production, I think that in terms of DAWs and electronic music production, I think a lot has changed in recent years, and being able to kind of think outside of the scheme of every project is already written. I think it's a very kind of old school mentality. But anyway, it's a small thing, but if you add up the amount of time each of these steps take over an entire year of music production, it's a lot of wasted time. And I feel like, especially for those who may be working a job and you only have like maybe an hour in the evenings to work on music production, every second counts. So here, for example, I just want to create a project so I can show you guys something that annoys me about Cubase. Now, I'm going to actually have to create a whole new folder, or what I'll have to do is just save it into the folder of another project, which then just makes that project overly complex. So anyway, item number 2 of things that I absolutely do not miss from Cubase is the absolutely shockingly bad MIDI timing in Cubase. Let me just outline it for you guys. So one thing also that kind of puzzles me, and it always has about Cubase, is that Cubase can't be a MIDI slave. So for example, I have a KeyStep Pro, which can be a MIDI host. That thing can generate the clock tempo and it can sync any DAW except Cubase, because I think the people at Cubase just think, playing music on synths is not a thing. I don't know. But yeah, Cubase can't receive MIDI clock. So that's a big no if you're coming from a background where you want to sequence stuff externally and maybe produce with you want to sequence and produce with like a synth or a modular synth or anything like that, and then just record it into the project at whatever the tempo is, and you want everything to be synced up. You can't do that in Cubase. It's shocking, I know. But not only that, is the timing of the MIDI is terrible. It's absolutely shocking. So I'm going to try and outline this for you guys. I think the easiest would be with something like Riffer. So I'm just going to add an instance of Vital into the project, and then I'm going to add an instance of Riffer into the project. So already we have 2 channels to achieve only one idea that we have in mind, which is already getting a little bit bloaty in terms of modern music production. So here, what we're going to have to do is, let's say, I'm just going to choose a scale that I've pre-designed. Let's say go F. So the scale is basically Phrygian missing a few notes. So it's just F something or other. So it's like basically F Phrygian, but without a few of the notes. So okay, we've got a random MIDI in there. Let's actually make this a bit longer just for some interest. Just for interest's sake. Make it 32. Set the amount of root notes up. Okay, so here we want to send this MIDI into Vital. Here what we're going to have to do is set MIDI channel. Okay, so going back to the Vital channel, we need to set this MIDI input to Riffer, right? And then if we set this monitor channel, it'll always just play through the audio, right? Can you guys hear that? Or should I put in some kind of click track to make it a little bit easier? Okay, so let's just maybe say, okay, maybe it's Riffer that's just generating us like not a really cool pattern. So let's just randomize this a few other times. So just to confirm my theory here, let's just record in some notes coming from Riffer. So once the MIDI is recorded in, it seems to represent something different from what we're actually hearing. Because if you look at the oscilloscope with the live MIDI, the timing is just doing its own thing. Look at the divisions of the 16ths. Let's actually just zoom in a bit further forward. Do you see how those notes are drifting so vastly backwards and forwards? So this makes these types of kind of live MIDI sequencing type of plugins almost unusable in Cubase. I mean, yes, you can potentially create a thing and record it in and then listen to how it sounds. But if you can't listen to what it sounds like in context, then it's never going to sound inspiring when you're actually trying to create these things. Do you know what I mean? Because immediately when we start playing with just Riffer running live into Vital, the timing is all off and it just doesn't sound right and it just doesn't make us feel the groove. And it almost makes me not want to carry on using this setup or this plugin or whatever the case may be. But then, in contrast, when you do the exact same thing in Bitwig, bang on, clock stable. Item number 3 of things that I absolutely do not miss from Cubase is how fixed architecture everything is within the DAW. So like I said, like I explained, having to create multiple channels to do a single idea, I think is a very archaic way of thinking about music production. Software like even Fruity Loops now with Patcher, Ableton with the racks, and now Bitwig with the layers, selectors, and XY system. The entire thing is built around the ability to kind of have one idea in mind and creating a channel to achieve that idea. However many different stacks of effects and all sorts of dry, wet routings and all sorts of things you want, you can achieve that all within a single plugin. A lot of the time, with Cubase, if you're wanting to do complex routings, you often have to send something out to a group channel and then split that group channel into several other channels and then do all these different things. And it often can take multiple channels to achieve one idea's worth of sound design. And on top of that, having the ability to quickly recall presets and ideas that you may have created before within the system just makes workflow so good. The fact that Bitwig's browser is also so good for just finding these ideas that you may have created in the past. So this example should outline how the example in number 2 about the MIDI timing is so much better in Bitwig, but also how this whole idea of less fixed architecture, being able to stack 3 channels within a single channel, so powerful. So to outline this is basically Riffer, Vital, and then almost like a send effect that I've baked into the patch. I want Vital to be able to filter without the reverbs being filtered, so I can kind of have almost like 2 layers of sound being created from a single sound. And that single sound is all being generated by Riffer. As it is, I just load the preset and press space, and it should just work in the context of the project. Whatever tempo, it just syncs, everything just works as it should. So this is one channel, no send effects, nothing, just one channel feeding into the master. It's our entire idea of a kind of background ambient bed baked into a single channel. So not only is the clock super stable and it just inspires and it allows you to jump in there and start working, but having everything baked into a single channel just makes things so much easier when you're coming back to it to fine tune things. Because now, for example, we just call this ambient bed / lead, and then everything that we need for the sound is in this track. So as we start adding things and as we start getting more complex with the project, we're not going to lose sight of what actually is going on, which group channels are assigned to what. And often diving into Cubase, I see people, it used to be a thing, maybe not so much anymore, but people flexing the size of their projects, how many channels there are in a project, and they would upload screenshots of these massive projects. But a lot of the time, those things are just like the same track or the same sound, but duplicated onto just like various different schemes of effects, And this leads me to my next point. There's something here called the selectors. So on this channel, I'm going to put on a effects selector. So what this does is it allows us to put on multiple different effects and then just choose between them. So in that context of, with Psytrance, where you'd have like one sound that then, plays in a bar and then the effects changes and then plays in a different bar, and, the whole staircase arrangement, that whole thing. You can do that so easily, even within a single track in Bitwig, by using effects selectors. So what I want to do here is I'm just going to pop in fact, I've got a little collection here of essentials, and I can just start throwing in, let's say, a snap heap in there. We can let it load, and then we can go in and choose a preset over here. I'm just going to choose something that I'm working on. Okay, so we've got a rack of 8 effects here. Now what we can do is we can set up a macro over here by adding a modulator. This is another thing I'm going to get to shortly. And then we can apply, let's just go back to the first in the rack. And we can apply this to this parameter over here, index. And now what this does is this allows us to actually just sweep through which rack is being played at what time. So we can modulate this or we can randomize this. You even have an overall mix control, so you can kind of like mix it in if you want the effects, choose which effect you want, all within a single track. Wow, incredible. So we can even take it a step further and nest this effects layer inside this instrument, this Riffer plus Vital plus effects instrument, to make things even easier to understand. Because now this is like one sound design idea, not only to understand, but like we could also now create one macro here, which is going to change the effects here. So we can set this back to 0, and we can put a macro over here, and let's set this to this index over here. So now we can close this off, close this, and we can call this FX selector. We can just jump in this project and we see, okay, we've got one thing here. We can select the effects. We can do things with the synths. You know, we've created a modular system which is now nested away. We don't have to think about it. We can just worry about these 5 macros. So another really cool thing that kind of ties into this whole idea is the ability to add effects to the feedback systems in the plugins. So this applies to the Bitwig reverb, it applies to the Bitwig delays, which there are several, by the way. So what this is basically, you can imagine, you know, like with most more advanced reverbs or more advanced delays, you can apply like filters to the reverb tails or the delay tails, or you can apply choruses to the delay tails and those kinds of things. In the context of the Bitwig built-in devices, they may not have all the features as those things, but they're modular in the sense that it allows you to add those features if you need them. So for example, we could add a reverb to just the tails of the delays by clicking this FB effects over here. So this stands for obviously feedback effects. So we could add a slight amount of reverb, maybe some phaser, and we can get really experimental by just adding a bunch of devices to just the delay tails or just the feedback system. And we can stack it a bit further. So we could, in this context, like here, we could say add a chorus to the tank effects of the reverb, which is on the feedback effects of the delay. So it's like, yeah, you can get inception with the sound design here. So let's put a chorus over here. I mean, just remember, like, we're stacking things beyond recognition here. Maybe I can actually just turn down the effects on this, just so we're getting a dry signal into this delay. So any of the effects, like say for example you want this combination of saturator and tool, you can just press Ctrl G and it layers it, and then you can just duplicate these elsewhere in the patch. Okay, number 4 on the list of things that I absolutely do not miss from Cubase is the archaic modulation system. So, or should I say absolutely lack of modulation system whatsoever. So, in fact, there is no way to have some kind of global LFO or, you know, modulator LFOs that send to other plugins. Like, for example, how we can do with the modulators in Bitwig. I know that Ableton Suite has the LFO stuff, or LFO devices, which you can then assign to various parameters in the other devices. Cubase has nothing like that. You can potentially set up something like GateLab to send CV, or you can set up GateLab to send MIDI to other devices. You can set up LFO tool to also do that. However, as we saw in the previous example, the timing is absolutely shoddy. So yeah, to actually get some nice modulations going inside Cubase is literally impossible unless the specific plugin allows for it. And this is a big letdown. For example, this is a big letdown, but it has opened the opportunities for developers like to make really advanced modulation systems like Kilohertz, like the Infiltrator system, and various others like Rift and all sorts of stuff like that. However, having the ability to do stuff similar to that in your DAW, in your DAW, to any device is just so cool. And what takes it a step further is that in Bitwig, it's, I believe, expandable. You can add as many modulators as you want. So we could potentially have add 3 LFOs here and just hold control and drag it to duplicate them. We could add 3 randoms here and just duplicate them. We could have, let's create steps. So we can have step sequences. We can have envelope. We can create all sorts of weird and wonderful things. Here's something really interesting is the vector system. I think vector 8 might be a little bit complex. Let's go with vector 4, in fact, just to make things a bit easier. So the vector modulators is a really, really sick way of being able to modulate advanced patches like this, where you may have like 4 parameters that you're often using. This allows us to create an XY modulator system with almost anything. So here we've got these 4 parameters, and we're going to set up these 4 modulators to modulate these one by one. So now we've set up this panel over here to now be like a XY that can now sweep between those 4 parameters with just one mouse movement. So this is really cool if you don't have a MIDI controller, or if you just want to get a lot more expressive and play your sounds a little bit differently to how you usually do. Such an infinitely complex patch, yet so expandable to the point where we have this interface which is so easy to understand and so easy to play. It's just one XY pad, and we've now created all the parameters that we need to literally just let this loop and create these endless loops of ambience and interest for the background of tracks and stuff. I feel like creating things like this where you can kind of play them in expressive manners is the real key to creating these very expressive background beds for your tracks. Often we try to write things in with MIDI, and it ends up sounding very rigid because we only have particular lines and structures which you can work with. I don't know if that makes sense. Number 5 of things that I absolutely do not miss from Cubase is I feel like Cubase is getting very bloaty. There's a lot of new kind of artist content and singer-songwriter content, like loops and backtracks and all sorts of stuff, that they're kind of adding to the project. Whether or not you actually buy them, I feel like they still load each time. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like I wait a long time for various things to load. There's stuff in the browser that I don't actually have on my computer. Like, for example, when you open some of the Cubase synths and you're browsing in the presets, it shows you stuff from content packs which you may not own. It's kind of like they're showing you all these presets that you could own, and then if you don't have it, it doesn't load, and it's this whole weird thing where, like, why would they show stuff in the browser that you can't use? You know, if I wanted to buy stuff, I would just go onto the store and buy it. The fact that it loads a bunch of stuff that we don't necessarily need, especially as we're going further forward into like the more modern music production and stuff, I feel like so fewer people are using that type of content. Or maybe it's just the crowds or the circles that I'm in. But so few people are using the kind of singer-songwriter backtrack type of content. And the people who do need that type of content can kind of just play the instruments themselves most of the time. And I feel like, you know, specifically with modern music, I feel like there's so much power in being able to curate your own library, choose what type of samples you want, what type of content you want, because 9 times out of 10, when a DAW is providing you with factory content, 9 times out of 10, you're going to want something that's specific to your style of music anyway. So you'll be looking for your own content and adding it. So I feel like, you know, the cool thing about Bitwig, again, the cool thing about Bitwig, blah, blah, blah. The cool thing about Bitwig is you can choose whether you want the factory content or not. You can just load the bare bones program, not use any of the factory content. In fact, I believe at this point, I may have not even installed the factory content. I just have Bitwig installed at the moment. And furthermore, you don't even have to install any plugins. You can literally just drag plugins from your VST3's folder. If you want your program to load very quickly and you maybe generally use built-in Bitwig devices, but there's like those 1 or 2 VSTs that you have that you sometimes use, you could potentially not have any VSTs loading into your DAW and then just drag them into your Bitwig when you need. So let me just find my VST3 folder. So here's an example. Like, we could just drag a VST straight from our hard drive, and we don't necessarily have to have that installed into Bitwig at that time. It will load it in the project, which I think is really, really cool. It kind of just like the fact that they're thinking about these things. I think for me, sample libraries is less about like having every sound that you will ever need, but more about having, you know, maybe 20 or 50 of the right sounds, because it's going to take you less time to find those sounds. You know, I feel like so many people have these terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of samples that they never touch. In fact, it just wastes time searching through all of those samples to find the ones that you actually do want to touch. Okay, I just want to end off with showing you guys a couple of extra really cool things in Bitwig. So these aren't in any specific category. I just felt like I wanted to add these in because you guys would really appreciate this. So Bitwig has a built-in multi-band system. This extends to any plugins. We don't necessarily only have to use Bitwig devices. So here we could, for example, have a rift in the mids. We could have a different rift in the highs and a different rift in the lows. So I know Rift 2 added multi-band mode, but it's just single band mode that you can kind of choose which frequencies it exists in. But using something like Bitwig's FX3, we can just create a multi-band rift if we want. So another really cool thing in Bitwig is the vocoder. So the vocoder in Bitwig acts like a container, much like the layers and selectors and effects container systems, where you have a modulator and a carrier that each have their own specific kind of like built-in channels, which is really, really cool. So this allows us to, you know, here by default, they've actually nested an effects grid inside the carrier. So what we could potentially do is actually just create a little synth here inside the thing. So we created a saw wave, and we can actually choose the pitch. So let's say pitch, and then choose this over here and set this to the input like this and set it to 120. So now we can actually choose at what pitch this is going to play at. So let's say F sharp, which is the pitch of the sample that we're going to drag in. Let's drag the sample into here. And by default, I believe the audio does feed through the modulator if you put it on an audio effect. However, that being said, is you can nest something inside the modulators here, like a sample, or you could nest potentially like another note effect, another Bitwig grid in there to generate vocal stuff. So now, if we nest this vocoder inside the effects here of this sampler, this gives us the ability to use modulators on this thing to modulate parameters in there. So let's say, for example, let's add a note on random by setting this to note and setting this to hold. And then we can get this to modulate the formant over here. This was a really nice effect that was creating there. We can duplicate it by holding control and dragging it. And then we can set this to, for example, like the grain size. That was also quite a nice effect that I was doing. In fact, let's go smaller grain size. Awesome, that is about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. And yeah, Bitwig people, if you're watching this and you're considering adding any of these features, I personally think that something like Vary Audio and something like the control room would certainly be the most beneficial to Bitwig as it exists already. I think a lot of the other stuff we can kind of work around with various other things that already exist in the software, but I feel like the control room thing, having a channel outside of the project, is amazing. Having Vary Audio or some kind of system which you can, not real time, but be able to shift the pitch of samples. Yes, you can do that in Bitwig with automation and stuff, but I feel like the way it captures it and just it's so easy in Cubase is just amazing. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to my channel. See you guys next time. Cheers.